When I drove away from that house for the last time, I wasn't crying. I think that surprised me more than anything else. 34 years of my life lived inside those walls, and all I felt was quiet. Not peace, not yet, just quiet, like the moment after a storm when the air hasn't decided what it wants to be. My wife was standing on the front porch watching me go. She didn't wave. She didn't say anything. She just stood there with her arms crossed, and I remember thinking, that's the pose of a woman who already knows what comes next. I didn't know then how right I was. That was March. By October, she had married my former business partner. I want to tell you this story the right way, because it's easy to start a story like this and make it about anger. And for a while, I won't lie to you, it was about anger. But that's not what it's really about. What it's really about is what a man decides to do when he finds out that the life he thought he was living was only half the picture. And what happens when the other half finally comes to light at a place no one expected. But let me back up, because you need to understand who I was before any of this makes sense. I spent 34 years building a company from nothing. My business partner and I started it out of my garage in Columbus, Ohio, with a used fax machine and enough stubbornness to embarrass ourselves into success. By the time things started to crack, we had 63 employees, 3 regional offices, and a contract with a logistics firm that kept the whole thing running like a heartbeat. I was 61 years old. I had given that company the best years of my energy, and I genuinely believed that the man I had built it with was my brother in every way that counted. His name was Derek. My wife's name was Sandra. I'll let you sit with that for a moment. We had 2 children. My daughter lived in Seattle and called on Sundays. My son lived 20 minutes away and barely called at all, but I told myself that was just how adult sons were, and I believed it because it was easier than the alternative. His name was Marcus. He was 32, worked in real estate, and had his mother's eyes and his mother's talent for telling you exactly as much as she decided you needed to know. Sandra was an event planner, high-end, corporate clients, the kind of work that put her in rooms with people who had more money than patience. She was good at it. She was charming and organized, and she always knew the right thing to say to the right person. I admired that about her for most of our marriage. It took me an embarrassingly long time to understand that those same skills had a shadow side. The marriage had been hollow for years. I can say that clearly now. At the time, I would have called it tired or busy, or just the natural settling that happens when 2 people have been together long enough. We didn't fight. We didn't laugh much either. We occupied the same house and the same calendar and the same bed like neighbors who had long ago run out of things to say to each other. I suggested counseling twice. Both times Sandra said she didn't believe in paying a stranger to confirm things she already knew. I asked her what she meant. She said she meant that every marriage had its rough patches, and you got through them by deciding to. I decided she was right because I wanted her to be right. Derek started coming to the house more often about 2 years before the end. We had always been the kind of partners who work well together socially. Dinner parties, company events, occasional weekends with families. His marriage had ended 5 years prior, amicably, or so I had been told. He was charming in the same rooms where Sandra was charming, and I remember more than once thinking that they were alike in ways that made them easy to be around. I remember thinking that, and then I remember putting the thought somewhere in a drawer and closing it. The drawer opened the morning my daughter called from Seattle and asked me, very carefully, whether I was doing okay. I said I was fine. I asked her why. She paused the way people pause when they're deciding how much of a kindness silence actually is. Then she said, "Dad, Marcus told me something. I don't know if it's true, but I think you should look at the business accounts. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and 3 years of financial documents and a cup of coffee that went cold before I touched it. By 4 in the morning, I had found enough. Let me tell you what I found. Not all of it, because even now some of it is still being sorted through attorneys, but enough for you to understand the shape of what had been happening. Derek had been running a secondary billing arrangement through a vendor account that existed, on paper, as a supply subcontractor. In practice, it was a holding structure. Money came in from our logistics contract, a percentage moved through this vendor account, and from there it went somewhere else. Somewhere that took me another week to trace because the entity was registered under a name I didn't immediately recognize. The name of the entity was S.E. Brennan Consulting. Sandra's maiden name was Brennan. Our monthly household expenses, which I had been reviewing with the perfectly ordinary attention of a man who believed he was being shown the real numbers, had been listed at around $4,000. The actual outflow, once I understood what I was looking at, was closer to $11,000. The difference was going into accounts I had never seen, attached to credit cards I didn't know existed, funding a second life that had been running quietly alongside mine for longer than I could stand to count. She had been funneling money out of our joint assets for over 3 years. Derek had been her mechanism and her partner in it. I want to tell you that I confronted them both immediately. I didn't. I spent 2 weeks being very still and very careful and very ordinary, because I had spent enough years running a business to know that you do not let the other party know the ground has shifted until you are standing on solid footing yourself. I called an attorney. I called an accountant who specialized in exactly this kind of forensic work. I made copies of everything. I documented what I could. I did all of this quietly, in the early mornings, before Sandra was awake, and I put my face back together every day and went through the motions, and I watched her across the dinner table, and I thought, 34 years. 34 years, and I still don't know who you are. I filed for divorce in February. Sandra's reaction was not what I expected. I had braced for anger or defensiveness, or maybe the particular cold calculation I had started to see underneath everything now that I was looking. Instead, she cried. Genuinely, I thought. Though I had learned recently that my ability to read her was not what I had believed it to be. She said she hadn't wanted it to go this way. She said she had been unhappy for so long, and she hadn't known how to say it. I listened. I did not tell her what I knew yet because my attorney had advised me to wait. I said I understood. I said I had been unhappy too. Marcus called me 2 days later. He didn't ask how I was doing. He said, "I think you know this is your fault, Dad. She needed things you never gave her." I said, "I'm sure you believe that." He said, "Derek is a good man. He's been there for her." I said, "I know he has." Marcus didn't hear what I meant. That was all right. He would, eventually. My daughter flew in from Seattle for a weekend in March. We sat on the back porch, and she didn't try to fix anything or take sides. She just sat with me. That weekend, I told her everything I had found. She was quiet for a long time afterward. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I told her I was going to get through the divorce, let the attorneys handle the financial piece, and then I was going to leave. She asked where. I told her I'd been looking at Portugal. She laughed a little, and then she said, "Good." The divorce took 8 months. I will spare you the full procedural weight of those 8 months because some things don't need to be relived in detail. They just need to be lived through. Sandra retained her own attorney. Derek was deposed. The vendor account situation moved from my personal attorney into the hands of people equipped to take it further. I was advised not to discuss the specifics publicly, and I followed that advice. What I will tell you is that the settlement was not what Sandra had expected. She had expected, I believe, that I was a man with no visibility into his own finances. She had expected to walk away with the house, half of the business, and a clean timeline into the next chapter she had already planned. She did not walk away with all of those things. The house sold. The business interest was valued and divided in a way that reflected certain findings. I cannot tell you more than that, except that when I walked out of the mediator's office on a Thursday afternoon in November, I felt, for the first time in almost 2 years, like I could breathe through my whole chest. I put 30 boxes into storage and a suitcase into my car, and I drove to my daughter's apartment and I slept for 11 hours. 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Lisbon. I had chosen it almost arbitrarily. A friend from my industry had retired there 2 years prior and sent me photographs once that I hadn't been able to stop thinking about. Light the color of honey on old stone. Streets narrow enough that the buildings on either side seemed to be having a conversation. A pace of life that did not apologize for being slow. I rented a small apartment in a neighborhood called Moraria. It was on the 3rd floor, above a bakery, and every morning the smell of bread coming through the window was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in years. I want to be clear about something. I was not happy when I arrived. I was empty, which is not the same thing but is sometimes necessary before happy becomes available. I walked a lot. I learned enough Portuguese to be politely incompetent with shopkeepers who were gracious about it. I called my daughter on Sundays. I did not call Marcus, and Marcus did not call me, and I told myself that was all right even when it wasn't. I had one friend in Lisbon, the retired industry contact named Paul, who met me for coffee twice a week in a square near his apartment and asked me questions about what I was thinking about instead of what I was doing, which was exactly the right kind of company for where I was. The months moved. November, December, January. In January, I received a text from a woman named Gloria, who had been Sandra's closest friend for over 20 years, and mine, I had believed, in whatever secondary way a spouse's friend becomes yours. Gloria and I had never been close in isolation, but she had always been kind to me and honest in the particular way of people who are constitutionally unable to sustain a performance. The text said only, "Thought you should know. They're getting married in March. Big ceremony. Marcus is best man." I sat with that information for a long time. I want to tell you I felt nothing. What I actually felt was a complicated thing that I don't have a clean word for, something between grief and the particular exhaustion that comes from realizing the story you're watching has been going on longer than you knew. Not jealousy. I want to be precise about that. Not jealousy. More like the feeling of finding an old photograph of yourself from a time when you didn't know yet what was coming. I wrote back to Gloria, "Thank you for telling me. I hope you're well." She wrote back, "Marcus told her you were probably jealous. He told Derek you were bitter and broke and living abroad because you had nothing left here. I thought you should know that too." I put the phone down and looked out the window at the street below, where a man was walking a very old dog very slowly, both of them taking full advantage of the morning. I thought about my son. I thought about the 32 years I had been his father, the way I had coached his little league team, the way I had driven 3 hours each way to watch him play in a college intramural game that didn't count toward anything, the way I had co-signed his first business loan and never once mentioned it again because I wanted him to feel it was entirely his accomplishment. I thought about all of that, and then I thought about him standing beside Derek at an altar, telling people his father was broke and bitter somewhere across the ocean. I cried that evening. I want to be honest about that. I cried, and then I made pasta, and I watched the street from my window, and I decided that what Marcus believed was not something I could fix from Lisbon, and possibly not something I could fix at all, and that the fixing was not my responsibility. I was not invited to the wedding. I had not expected to be. What I had not expected was the phone call I received on a Tuesday evening in late March, 2 days after the ceremony. It was Marcus. He did not say hello. He said, "Is it true?" I said. "You're going to have to tell me what you're asking." He said, "Someone at the wedding, one of Derek's old clients, stood up during the reception and asked Derek in front of everyone whether the regulatory findings from last year had affected his current business." Structure. Dad, what is that? What does that mean? I was quiet for a moment. "It means," I said, "that Derek has been operating under a compliance review since October. It's a matter of public record. I didn't put that man in the room. I don't know who he is, but it sounds like Derek's professional past has a way of introducing itself." Marcus was quiet. "Did Mom know?" he said finally. His voice had changed. It was the voice that had changed. It was the voice of a man beginning to understand that there are floors beneath floors. "Marcus," I said, "you're going to want to sit down and talk to your sister. She knows more than I've told you. I didn't say anything to you before because you didn't ask, and because some things a person has to be ready to hear." He was quiet for a long time. "You didn't say anything," he said. "Not an accusation. More like a man turning something over and finding an unexpected weight to it." "No," I said. "I didn't." "Why?" "Because I'm your father," I said. "Not your lawyer and not your judge. And because I didn't need you to vindicate me. I needed you to be okay. Those aren't always the same thing." I heard him exhale. "I said some things," he said. "You did, to people. About you." "I know." He didn't apologize then. That would come later, and it would be real when it did, and I would accept it without making him carry it longer than necessary. But on the phone that Tuesday night, what Marcus said was, "Are you okay over there?" Honestly. And I said, "Honestly? Yes. I think I actually am." I want to tell you what the following months look like, because I think people assume that when the story resolves, the main character goes back to what he was before, and that's not what happened. I did not go back to who I was before. There was no going back, and I stopped wanting to. What there was instead was the slow, real, sometimes boring work of building something new, not dramatic, not cinematic, just daily and true. I started consulting part-time for a logistics firm based in the UK with European operations. The work was interesting and it was mine in a way the old work hadn't been for a long time. I expanded my Portuguese lessons from twice a week to daily. I started walking further each morning into neighborhoods I hadn't explored, and I found that a city reveals itself to you in layers if you give it enough time and enough quiet. My daughter came to visit in May. We walked for 3 days straight and ate in small restaurants, and she told me about the life she was building in Seattle, and I listened in the way I had not always listened when I was too busy and too distracted and too inside my own exhaustion to be fully present. I am not going to be the father I could have been when she was 25, but I can be the father I am now, and I think that matters. Marcus called on a Sunday in June, a real call, not a task, not a confrontation, just a call. He told me about a property he was working on. He asked me questions about the consulting work. At the end he said, with some difficulty and considerable plainness, "I'm sorry for what I said about you, to people, and to you. I was wrong." I said, "I know it wasn't easy to say that. Thank you." He said, "Are you ever coming back?" I said, "I don't know. Maybe to visit. But I think I live here now." He said, "Do you like it?" I thought about the bakery smell in the morning, the afternoon light on the old stone, Paul asking me questions about what I was thinking about, the way the city moves at a speed that doesn't demand anything from you that you're not ready to give. Yeah, I said, I like it. I want to close with something I've been thinking about since all of this happened, because I think it matters and I don't want to put it in a place where it sounds like a lesson being handed out at the door. It's not a lesson, it's just what I've come to understand. I spent 34 years in a life that I thought I was seeing clearly, and I wasn't. That's not entirely Sandra's fault, and it's not entirely mine. Two people can occupy the same marriage and be living in completely different stories. And sometimes neither person knows until the ending arrives and reveals what the whole thing was actually about. That's a strange and painful thing to understand about yourself, that you were not the protagonist in someone else's narrative that you thought you were sharing. But here is what I also know. Derek is currently operating under a compliance framework that has significantly constrained his ability to continue what he was doing. The accounts connected to S.E. Brennan Consulting were included in the financial settlement review. Sandra did not walk away with the house. The life they had planned, to the extent that life responds to plans, has not unfolded the way they arranged it. I didn't do any of that. I made one decision: to be careful, to be patient, and to let the truth do what the truth does when you stop covering for it. Justice is not something I needed to carry. I just needed to stop standing in its way. I am 63 years old, and I live above a bakery in Lisbon, and I walk 3 miles every morning before the city is fully awake. And I talk to my daughter on Sundays and my son on most Sundays now. And I am building something I don't have a name for yet, but that feels, for the first time in a long time, entirely like mine. I think that's enough. I think that's actually more than enough. And to everyone listening tonight, thank you for being here with me. I'll see you next time.